So one of my origin points for being interested in the idea of partition was noticing how frequently the concept of partitioning Iraq came up in the aftermath of the American invasion in 2003. And it's a conversation that has continued to the present day, right? We are seeing kind of perpetual discussions among the pundits about the possibility of redividing Iraq in some way. And it's actually an example that very much follows the kind of British imperial and post-colonial pattern, because what has happened is that in the American invasion of Iraq, the United States sought as an explicit policy, particularly after the so-called surge of 2007, to separate Sunni and Shia populations within the cities and within the state of Iraq. So during the surge, one of the things that American troops were charged with doing was to build walls, physical walls, between neighborhoods that would now be designated as Sunni or Shia, which had never previously been the case. You know, it's a very mixed city, historically speaking. In fact, was 25% Jewish in the interwar period. So, and then this gives us a rationale, this gives the United States a rationale for protecting the interests of these various constituencies through a military presence. So then this conversation about partition and who would enforce it and how would its outcomes be protected is also bound up with the continuation of some sort of American political and crucially military presence in Iraq that will have to be there in perpetuity. So I think it's a very clear example of the way in which the discourse of partition as a form of national liberation has been deployed for the purposes of what are essentially imperial powers and imperial interventions, and that's very, very much an ongoing process.
Absolutely. I think that thinking about the more recent Israeli-Palestine history and chronicles, and if you go to the 1990s, that the two-state solution and the Oslo Accords kind of brought back basically what is an idea of a partition. So if you would like, one can read the 1990s as an attempt to close that window that was opened and to create these two states that never emerged in the wake of the 1947 UN resolution. As we know, it never worked out, and the discourse is of course a discourse of separation. Israeli politicians will use expression like "we are here, they are there," with the underlying assumption that peace, quote unquote, is unattainable unless you separate communities, because the idea of a minority is intolerable. So it's not only a collapse of the idea of minority treaties and some sort of a configuration that would allow minorities to exist, but it really is. It ties today, unfortunately, with very populist kind of discourse that is emerging both from the bottom and from the bottom up and top down. So it's a very, I think that it's a lens through which it's definitely a historical lens, but it's a very poignant lens that one can use in observing contemporary politics as well.
And I think, too, another thing that we haven't mentioned but should is the way that partition forces a decision on people between two communities. It preempts the idea that somebody could belong to both, right? Which has historically been the case for many, many people in Palestine, Israel, and across the Middle East more generally, as well as in other contexts, to have mixed multi-communal families, multilinguistic families, multinational families. These are all real social phenomena that partition and the concept of partition and the practice of partition does enormous violence to. So I think that that's another thing that we need to talk about when we're discussing the kind of human face of partition, is that it forces a very, very painful choice on people who might otherwise think about their lives in a much more kind of pluralistic setting.